Okay, good evening, everyone. It's great to see you again. Just a quick reminder that we're going to take a break next week for Hanukkah, and then we will have our final session of the four-part series the week after, for the final week in December. Last time we spoke about the rise of Hasidus. We talked about the fact that Hasidus, immediately in the aftermath of the life and work of the Baal Shem Tov, even up until 1772, 12 years after the death of the Baal Shem Tov, Hasidus is still a relatively small, somewhat regional phenomenon. If you were traveling through Eastern Europe at the time, the likelihood of your encountering Hasidus, a Hasidic court, a Hasidic Rebbe, it was probably pretty low. The center moved from this area in the south up to this area, from this area of Mezhebaz to the area ultimately of Mezerich, with the student of the Baal Shem Tov, the Maggid of Mezerich. It really, though, is in the period that follows where Hasidus begins to spread and spread quite considerably throughout all the areas of what used to be Poland in this case. And this is a phenomenon that we noted last time will continue well through the 19th century, all the way into the 20th century, when Hasidus truly conquers a great portion of the hearts and minds of the religious Jews, right, in Eastern Europe, right up until the precipice of the Shoah. We talked about various reasons why Hasidus had or came to be, what to some degree its allure was. We also noted that as successful as Hasidus was, if you looked at those maps carefully, the Hasidus tended to spread down here in these areas, and there's an area up here, and it's not that clear. Let me see if I can make this just a little bit clearer. I feel like you're at the eye doctor. Right. But so this big box up here that says Vilna, right? That area in and around the environs of Vilna continues to be an area where Hasidus doesn't make great inroads. So the green color represents, you can see it down here, 1% or less of the Jewish population affiliated with Hasidus to the best of our estimation. So as successful as Hasidus was in these areas, it seems to not take root in the areas in and around Vilna. And traditional historiography will tell you that much of that has to do with the work, the impact, the personality of this man known as the Vilna Gaon. More recent historiography has suggested perhaps a slightly different story. A story that goes more like this, that in fact, the areas around Vilna, these areas of what used to be Lithuania, were entrenched in a culture long before the Vilna Gaon shows up that really was not very hospitable to many of the ideas of Hasidus. That in fact, it may not have taken root even perhaps without the efforts of the Vilna Gaon. In fact, some will go so far as to suggest something quite different. You see, we said last time that 1772, that was the beginnings of the partition of Poland, but we noted that at 1772, at about that time, right, is also the first time that we begin to have official opposition to Hasidus, but it's also the time in which Hasidus really begins to spread. So as much as we can look at this point, this area, and say, you know what, it never really gets there. Perhaps it was the personality of the Vilna Gaon that pushed back Hasidus. Others suggest that perhaps maybe the story is a little different. Maybe it's this clash. Maybe it's the outward opposition to Hasidus that actually encourages Hasidic leaders to galvanize their efforts, to rally their troops, to get their message more on point, perhaps even to modify their message a little bit. And in fact, it's the public opposition to Hasidus that helps the spread of Hasidus, not the reverse. But either way, it seems that the role of the Vilna Gaon plays an outsized part of this story. We also noted, though, at the end of our last lecture, that it may have been this man pictured up here on the screen, or it may have been this man, or this one, or this one, or that one. It could have been this man, or that man. This one. Now we're really at the eye doctor, right? Or that one. Is it the same person? Yeah. How about this one? This is a Rosh Hashanah card from 1900. This is the Art Scroll biography from about 90 years later. So which one of these is the Vilna Gaon? They all claim to be the Vilna Gaon. And they are pretty radically different. Now, there are similarities, right? There are absolutely some similarities. There seem to be some families here, some families of faces, some families of portraits. And honestly, I'm not even so interested in knowing which one is really the Vilna Gaon. You know why? Because I don't think any of them, honestly, are the Vilna Gaon, because as we'll see in just a few minutes, I don't think the Vilna Gaon ever sat for a portrait. In fact, I'm pretty sure he never did. But here's what interests me, is why are there so many depictions of the Vilna Gaon and so many different depictions of the Vilna Gaon? And the question becomes even stronger when we compare the picture of the Vilna Gaon, or the pictures of the Vilna Gaon. Does everybody remember the picture of the Baal Shem Tov from last week? No? Come on, somebody remembers it. Very good. There was none. Good for you, right? Oh, everybody feels a little better about themselves right now. Okay. Yes, there was none. In fact, even if you do a Google search, there is one image that will come up, right? But all you need to do is click just a little bit, and even Wikipedia knows that that is not the Baal Shem Tov. It's not Rabbi Yisrael ben Eliezer. It's somebody who is known as the Baal Shem of London. Right? We spoke about this last time. Baal Shem. It was a pretty popular position. There's nothing that even claims to be a picture of the Baal Shem Tov. Now, isn't that fascinating? These are two people who lived within 20 years of each other. Right? They're not coming from different eras. They were both wildly influential in their communities. And yet one has this whole string of images that have been put out there, right? Different ones, and yet the other, nobody even put out a fake, right? There isn't even an attempt to depict. So, to understand why we have so many different depictions of the Vilna Gaon, I think we have to understand two things first. Number one, we need to understand the Vilna Gaon. Who was he? The man, actually. What do we know about him? What were his salient traits? And the second thing, and probably come to expect this from me at this point, is we need to understand what was happening in the world of Jewish history. Now, this time, not in the 16th through the 18th century, but this time in the 19th century, which is really going to give rise to the images that we just saw. So, here we go. Let me move my little picture over here. So who was the Vilna Gaon? Well, let's start with this. His name was Eliyahu ben Shlomo Zalman. You may see me referring to him as the Gra. The Gra simply stands for the Gaon, Rabbi Eliyahu, born in 1720. He dies in 1797. I'm going to open this to make sure that I am on camera most of the time, at least. My father liked to remind me of that. I think a high school Rabbi of his once did that. Well, probably not with a PowerPoint, right? But it kind of stuck out in his mind to the point where he told me about it. And so there you have it. All right. When we were fighting about Stiebels and Nusach Svard and what kind of Shlita knives over in one part of the world, they were fighting about no taxation without representation, right? All of that in another. Did they know each other? No, as far as I know, right? They certainly didn't speak to each other, didn't know each other, but yes, they were living at exactly the same time. Good, now back to our program. Okay, Eliyahu ben Shlomo Zalman, known as the Grub, lives from 1720 to 1797. Let me begin to describe to you who the Vilna Gaon was not. He was not an official member of the leadership of the Vilna community. He holds no official position. He's not the rabbi of Vilna. He's not the head of the Beis Din of Vilna. He doesn't run a yeshiva in Vilna, nothing. He holds no official communal position. That having been said, he is supported by some combination of the community and a fund, actually a family fund. It seems he had ancestors who had money, who put away a fund to support scholars who would dedicate themselves to full-time Torah learning, and he was a beneficiary of that fund. So he was paid to study, to learn Torah. That's what he did. He had no job outside of that. He had no responsibilities outside of that. So he holds no official position. He also has no official students. Now, that's ironic because we actually have a whole group of people who are often referred to as Talmidei Hagra, right? Talmidei Hagra, the students of the Vilna Gaon. So what do I mean when I say he has no official students? Well, I think when we talk about somebody being a student of somebody else, right, when we talk about students, we generally conjure up an image of relatively young people, right? If we're here, we're talking about the Torah world of Europe, right? So we're talking about boys, we're talking about young men, either immediately after finishing Cheder at the age of 13, perhaps a little bit later, 15, 16, who go to study in some sort of official kind of framework with a teacher of some sort, and they're there for a few years. And they have some sort of curriculum, some sort of course of study that they pursue together with their teacher. That makes for a Rebbe and a Talmud. The Vilna Gaon did not have Talmidim in that sense. What did he have? He had adults who are often quite accomplished in their own Torah learning already, who did come and study with him later on in life. So let me give you an example. There is, well, let me ask you this. How many of you have a biography of the Vilna Gaon at home? Okay, good. So the truth of the matter is probably more of you have one than you thought. Right? Now, this is not an academic biography of any sort, right? But one of the best sources of biographical material on the Vilna Gaon is actually found in the introduction written by his sons to his commentary on the Shulchan Aruch. So if you have a Shulchan Aruch at home, you have one of the best sources for biographical material on the Vilna Gaon. Somebody want to read this for me? Just kidding. Then you really need the eye doctor. Okay, so this is written by his sons Yehuda, right, and Avram, two rabbis. And in it is a whole bunch of biographical material that we're going to come to shortly. But I want to call your attention right now to a list that actually appears right here. It's sort of the second page. A little bit, again, you can maybe see the word Talmid up there, but he actually lists the all-star Talmidim of the Vilna Gaon. He lists 7 of them, right? And he lists them: Harishon, Hasheni, Maslishi, Rabbi, Hamishi, Shishi, and Shvi'i, 7 men who were considered to be Talmidim of the Vilna Gaon. And who do you think is number 1 in this list? Anybody know? Okay, excellent. Right, the person that we know is Chaim Volozhiner, right, who ultimately will go on to create the yeshiva in Volozhin, Yeshivas Eitz Chaim in Volozhin, founded a letter circulated in 1802. Yeshiva opens up in 1802. Okay, Harishon. Haya Amruai Haya Harav HaGaon Moreno Rav Chaim right Zegil as Kadosh Volozhin. Chaim Volozhiner, the number one Talmud of the Vilna Gaon. So what less people know, though, is the Hakdama to the introduction to Chaim Volozhiner's magnum opus, his great work, which was what? What was his great work? Nefesh HaChaim, good, which actually didn't publish, never made it out in his lifetime. His son, right, will bring it to publication. His son, Rav Itzela of Volozhin, is the second Rosh Yeshiva of the Volozhiner Yeshiva, and he writes some biographical information about his father in his introduction to this work. And in this Hakdama, we learn he identifies that his father's Rebbe, he blew it as Darka Shel Torah from who? From Aryeh Leib Ginsburg, otherwise known as the Shagas Aryeh. The Shagas Aryeh was Reb Chaim Volozhiner's Rebbe in the sense that we would think of it. And then the Karhaya Kvar Esrim the Chanesh, when he was 25 years old, then he went, it says, together with his brother, and they began to study with the Vilna Gaon. So the reality is, and when they went to study, what would that look like? They often went for, the Vilna Gaon Chaim Volozhiner probably had the longest consecutive time with the Vilna Gaon, but maybe it was a couple of weeks, maybe a couple of months at a time. What would you learn when you went there? Well, whatever the Vilna Gaon was learning, right, is what you would learn. And you may bring him your questions, right, and he may give you answers, but there was no curriculum. There was no official course of study. These were not boys who would come to learn in the way in which we would think traditionally a Talmud and a Rebbe. He also writes no official books. Now that's also a little bit ironic or hard to understand, because if you go into Yeshiva University's course catalog, into their library catalog, and you do an author search for Elijah ben Solomon, that's the Vilna Gaon, you get 429 works authored by the Gaon of Vilna. Now, to be clear, there are multiple editions of the same work in that list. Okay, so let's say there were 10 editions of every work that he published, and that's a lot. You would still have 43 books, 42.9 books that the Vilna Gaon authored. So what do you mean he wrote no official books? Well, actually, there's one library that probably has more Sfarim than the YU library, and that is the National Library of Israel, found in Hebrew University in Yerushalayim. And if you do the same thing, you do an author search in Hebrew University on their catalog, you actually get 906 books authored by the Vilna Gaon. So the reality is as follows. The Vilna Gaon wrote, and he wrote all the time. Anytime he was learning, he was writing, and he was writing his own notes. Not only that, when these accomplished Talmidei Chachamim would come and learn with him, they would write notes on anything that the Vilna Gaon was saying. Now, could the Vilna Gaon have intended to publish some of his works? Maybe. He doesn't. He doesn't bring it. Nothing gets published in his lifetime, but after he passes away, all of this voluminous material that he wrote gets published, right? And we'll see later, there was a bit of controversy around what to publish and where, what actually came from him, what came from his students. And so he writes no official books. He writes a ton. But in fact, right, one might make the argument that if you count all of the things that are said to be written by the Vilna Gaon, he may have written on more areas of Torah than perhaps any other commentator in Jewish history. That's how prodigious his work was. But nonetheless, none of them were written, at least to the best of our knowledge. We don't know that any of them were written, right, intended to be books. Here's what we do know about it. Probably the best way to begin to conceptualize the Vilna Gaon is that he was a man of extremes. Extremes. What do I mean by that? Extreme brilliance. Right? And when we say extreme brilliance, there is no other way to say it, right? His intellectual capacity seems to have been not just once in a generation, but once in a millennium. I mean, it was the type of intellect that anybody who encountered him, right, regarded as incredibly exceptional. Even those who were most opposed to him never questioned his brilliance, right, in multiple different areas. Extreme confidence. This was a man who was not shy. Now, that doesn't mean arrogance, but extremely confident in his own abilities. I couldn't find a better English word for this. You have to excuse the punctiliousness, but I mean dikduk b'mitzvos. There is no good English word for that. And if I tried to translate that, it'd be too big for my little thing up there. So punctiliousness, he was extremely careful in his observance of halacha, extremely careful in his observance of halacha, extreme asceticism. This was a man who shunned the pleasures of the world in what we would consider to be extreme fashion, and ultimately extreme in his opposition to Chassidus. So let's look at each one of these. Extreme brilliance. So back to the hakdama, to the introduction by his children to his parish on the Shulchan Aruch. So here's what they write. They write with a degree of specificity, which gives it some weight. And even if some of the details are a little bit off, they give you an impression that is pretty hard, right, to deny, right, or that would be pretty hard to make up. So when he was 6.5 years old, he gave a drasha in shul, a drasha in learning in Lumdus that his father had trained him on. And by Shalashudis, they brought him in front of the Rav of Vilna, the head of the Beis Din in Vilna, and they started asking him questions on what he gave. What does it say? Right? They said, have we ever seen a child as brilliant as this one? The Yosef ben Kesha Shanim, the Yadav Ralo, the Mikra, the Mishnah, the Gemara. When he was 9, he was satiated. He had finished all of Chumash, all of Mishnah, all of Gemara, the Gaon Midrash Agados, right? And also the whole world of Agada. He had been through it all. He knew it. Then what did he do? Right? He moved from the world of Mishnah, Gemara, Chumash, into the world of Nistar, the world of Kabbalah. At 9. The world of Kabbalah, by the way, took him half a year. This was a man of extraordinary intellectual gifts and talents. Multiple sources attest to the fact that he had literally the entirety of the corpus of Torah on his fingertips. Right? That's what you experienced if you saw him, if you talked to him. It was simply all there for him all the time. And it's going to become important in just a minute. But it wasn't just Torah. We have good evidence to support the fact that the Vilna Gaon was quite knowledgeable in areas outside of what we would consider strict areas of Torah as well. So this is famously a book that was published called Ayil Mishulash, right? Which is Al Chachmas HaMishulashim Ve'al Handasa, U'b'tocho Gam Kein, what is that? I can't read it up there. Can you see it? No. There. But it's called a Tuna Be'algebra. Oh, banana. Yeah? I can't read it in there. Okay, but this is a book this is a book on triangles, right? And geometry. And in it is also some principles of astronomy and algebra. Right? Now, he continues to say, actually, we'll see it in the next one. Why was the Vilna Gaon interested in these things? Because certain areas of halacha can't be understood unless you have a basic understanding, right, of triangles and geometry and some basic ideas around algebra and certainly astronomy. But it wasn't just math. Right? This comes from the introduction to the Gra's commentary on Avos, written by Rabbi Mendel Shklov. And here he writes that who can talk, who can say, who can describe the knowledge and the incredible wisdom that he had. Right? He even knew music. Right? He knew all other wisdoms also. Because we have his notes from other areas of wisdom as well. And he writes, just know that they were all handmaidens and perfumes for him for the study of Torah. But did he know it? Yes, clearly he did. Okay. Extreme confidence. Those who are familiar who have learned the Vilna Gaon before, right? So you know that even contemporary poskim, 20th century poskim, I believe the Chazon Ish said this and others, talk about considering the Vilna Gaon like a Rishon. What does that mean? Why do they consider him like a Rishon? Meaning like an earlier stage, an earlier posek, because we have a general rule in halacha, right, that later sages don't blatantly argue with earlier sages. We may explain, right? We may rectify, we may harmonize, but we don't clearly, right, contradict what earlier sages may have said. That is not the case with the Vilna Gaon. He has no compunction simply saying they were wrong. And not on like little issues, like big issues, like when does Shabbos start or end? Right? Where he has no compunction saying, well, they got it wrong. And here's how you need to do it going forward. But it wasn't just in areas of halacha where he had the confidence to say, it's not the way you thought it was. Right? Another area where he spends quite a bit of his energy is around the fixing of girsaos, the fixing of texts that are in front of him. Meaning the Hebrew print industry begins along with print in the late 15th century, but it doesn't really come into its own until actually the 19th century, which we're going to talk about in a little bit. Right? But the Vilna Gaon would get texts, whether they were texts of Sifrei, Sifra, the Zohar, right? Rabbinic texts, old rabbinic texts, and he would look at it and he would say, this is not right. The text that's printed that's in front of me is wrong. There's a mistake here. And he would take out his red pen and he would change it. Right? The Gemara as well, right? He would simply take out his pen and change it. Now, how did he do that? Why did he do that? Some people have claimed he had access to manuscripts. There is no evidence whatsoever that the Vilna Gaon had access to any old manuscripts. The Vilna Gaon's emendations of the text came from the fact that he could see in his own head multiple versions of this same text, the way this text appears in multiple other Masechtot, quoted by multiple other Rishonim, a parallel found in this medrash or in that medrash over there, and in his mind, he could see it at once and said, this text that's in front of us, this is a mistake, this is what it's supposed to say, and he would cross it out, and he would write what the text is actually supposed to say. That takes extreme confidence, right? Extreme confidence to open a work that's been around for hundreds, if not 1,000 years, more. Right? He's writing in the 18th century. Right? These are texts that have been around for 1,500 years, and simply say, "Hey, what you got in front of you is not right. Let me tell you what it's supposed to say." Back to our text of the Hakdama. So here, I'm going to read it. It's going to be clear for me on here. Right? So we're back into his development, right? He says, Shisha Shanim. Izain v'choker heitev Talmud Bavli v'Yerushalmi v'Toseftos Mechilta v'Sifra v'Sifrei v'Heir Afilas Cheshkas Ani Anuschos, right? V'Derech HaChachma. For 6 years, he went through all of Talmud Bavli, all of Yerushalmi, all of Toseftos, all of Mechilta, all of Sifrei, all of Sifra, and fixed the text. Fix the text so that it says what it's supposed to say, right? And he said, he does it, by the way, in the world of Nistar also. While hatzilam mikol michshol v'shgia, right? L'taritz divrayim, because there's mistakes in it, and so he was going to fix it. Excellent question. We're going to get to that in a minute. Extreme punctiliousness. So this is a letter that the Vilna Gaon writes on his way to the land of Israel. The Vilna Gaon wanted to make Aliyah. He wanted to live in Israel. And there's much discussion over why. A big group of his students, right, will actually go to Israel. I believe 1808 is the year that they actually go. And so he's on his way now. He writes a letter to his wife. It's a wonderful letter with all sorts of instructions to her about her children, and these are just a few excerpts from it. I ask you to refrain from becoming sad, as you truly promised me, and not to worry. It is common for men to leave their wives in order to travel and wander destitute for years to make money. Right? But I, thank God, I'm traveling to the Holy Land, which everyone longs to see, the Jewish people's most beloved. And I am traveling in peace, thank God, and you are also aware that I have left behind my children, for whom my heart moans, and all my precious books, and I am as a stranger in a foreign country. Yes, I have left everything behind. I reiterate my request that you guide your sons and daughters with words of kindness and musar that will find a place in their heart. This is true especially if we merit to arrive in Eretz Yisrael, because one must be extra cautious to follow Hashem's ways there. I believe quite strongly that what motivated the Vilna Gaon to go to Israel is simple. Right? It's that you can keep more of halacha in Israel. You can keep more mitzvos in Israel. And there is nothing that motivated the Vilna Gaon more than the ability to keep mitzvos. Right? And so if you can do that more in the land of Israel, that's where he needed to be. Therefore, train them well, since one must work hard on one's speech and character traits, and only through good habits can we control ourselves. Concerning solitude, the main thing is to remain at home. Even your visit to the synagogue should be very short. In fact, it is better to pray at home, for it is impossible to be spared from jealousy or from hearing idle talk or lashon hara in a synagogue. Some things change and some things don't, right? But what is the Vilna Gaon saying here? It's a simple halakhic equation. Right? There is no doubt that from a purely halachic perspective, it is far worse to engage in those sins, the possibility of lashon hara, of jealousy. Jealousy, that's in the 10 Commandments, right? That's a big one. There's no mitzvah that says, certainly for women, that they have to come to shul. Right? Socially, it's a very big part, right, of our world today. But the Vilna Gaon wasn't bothered by such things. It was about what is the letter of the law. And if it's possible that you're going to come there and you're going to feel some sort of jealousy for somebody else, you're going to speak lashon hara, stay home. Halachically, there's no question that it would be better, right? And this is even more so on Shabbos and Yom Tov, when they gather to talk. It is then better that you don't pray at all. Refrain also from going to the cemetery, especially women, as it leads to all kinds of sorrow and sin. And it is advisable that your daughter not go to the synagogue because she'll see beautiful clothes there, become jealous, and talk about it at home. This will lead to lashon hara. For the sake of Hashem, give a fifth of all earnings to charity. Do not give less, as I have already warned you, right? Because the causes that causes the transgression of several positive and negative mitzvos every minute. Right? These equations of how to live my life based on what is more chamor and what is more kal. Right? That is the way that the Vilna Gaon lived his life. Okay. Asceticism. No problem. Asceticism. Here we go. Better for me to read from here. Starting on the bottom here. Hein biyoso ben yud gimel shana v'yom echad kibel tokev chasidaso prishuso Kitofas Re'emla. When he was 13 years old, he took asceticism on himself. Prishus, separating from the rest of the world. Lo histakel od yom ad yom moso midalad amosav chutza. He didn't look out of his 4 cubits to the rest of the world from that point till the day of his death. Now, obviously, these are exaggerations, right? We understand, right? But he's describing a certain way of life, right? Right? Achal lechen tsar tzenua shruya b'mayim shir bezesim. He absolutely would not take any pleasure from this world. What did he eat? He ate water dipped, bread dipped in water, twice a day, once in the morning, once at night. Right? Fine, good. Let's keep going. Up on the top. How far, what great lengths he went to distance himself from the companionship of his children. Rak yiras Hashem tahora lishachna darash ben kseif of shachin ad shemeimavlo sha'ales banav ubnosav be'esek parnasasam mahus matzavam, to the point where he didn't ever ask his children how they were doing, how they were making a living. This is his children writing. He never wrote them a letter to ask them what was going on. And even if one came to visit and he hadn't seen them for a year or two, even though he was really happy, he refrained from engaging in any kind of idle conversation with them about how they were doing, about what was going on in their world. But wait, there's a story. A story about their brother, Moreno Shlomo Zalman Zal. Biyoso ben Chamesh Shanim o Keben Sheish, Hayarach, the Yachid Liaviv, the Aviv Avo, Sha'ashua Bechol Eis. This was their younger brother, right? Who was beloved by their father, but he was frail. But the father recognized his great midos and his tzidkus. Pam achas nafal lemishkav terev shav ama liesano. Hiskim mar abba Gaon zal bedato linsoa el makom asher heichin lihispodeb. So the Vilna Gaon would pretty regular frequency would leave the home to go someplace. He had a place in the woods where he would go to be able to study unbothered and undistracted. And he had made up that he was going to go. But his son, his beloved son, Shlomo Zalman, got sick. So this place that had gone, Shiva Parsaos, Mikilas Kodesh Vilna, it was seven Parsaos outside of the town, 4 or so miles from Vilna. Haboke or, the Yisrael Amako Mahu, Lis Boded, Kipam Bapam. Right? That morning, he left, even though his son was sick. Right? Shama niskiru ma'anyano ateva, right? Ashashachach beso ubanav yoser mechodesh yamim. And he lost himself in his learning for more than a month, didn't think about his kids. Pam achas halach lebeis harachitza, golav yadua she'asur lahar hersham b'divrei Torah, hischila ayin binyanav. The nizkar ki b'derech zu halach mi beiso yoser michodesh yamim, right? Ubanav, right? Ube, does it say banav? Chaviva mishalech betumo, right? V'nezav, right? Mimenu mushkav al erish davyo. The nichmeru rachama v'tziva le'esro richba lashuv lebeisa lifkod lishlomo. So what happens? He gets to one. So he's there for a month, and he decides to visit the bathhouse. And we all know that what can't you do in a bathhouse? Can't learn Torah. So now he has changed his mindset for the first time in a month to not thinking about Torah. And all of a sudden, he becomes all emotional. He remembers his kid who is at home and is sick. And he determines at that time he's going to go home to check on him when he gets out of the bathhouse. Okay. Again, it's hard. It's hard not to transpose our values from the world that we live in onto him. and his world. This was not seen as something that was a negative. How do I know that? Because it's here. Exactly. They're writing about it, his sons, writing about it in the Hakdama to his work. It's something they're very proud of. But what we clearly see is that this is a man who constantly was battling any type of inner feeling he might have that may take him away from the world of Torah study. So asceticism certainly in the extreme. And what about his opposition to Chassidus? So the story of the opposition to Chassidus is a story. I do think I can get this. Okay. The story of this opposition to Chassidus is one that actually starts not in Vilna but in Shklov. In 1772, there is a quote-unquote debate between Chasidim and those who oppose. Understand, in areas of Lita, Chasidim were a minority. We're a very small group. The communal infrastructure was dominated by those who were opposed to Chassidus. So what kind of actual debate this was, I doubt it was one that was very fair, but certain things came out in that conversation about certain practices of the Chasidim, certain beliefs of the Chasidim. A letter was sent from Shklov to Vilna reporting what had happened. There was investigation. There was closure of the shtibel, the Hasidic shtibel in Vilna. There were floggings, that is, physical violence against Hasidim, harassments of various sorts. There was ultimately a cherem that was announced, a ban announced that officially closed and prohibited participation in Hasidic davening, in the Hasidic shul. Letters were sent out from there to other communities, encouraging them to do the same. By the time we get later into the 1780s, so 1781 marks the publication of Toldos Yaakov Yosef, that is the student of the Besht, who we talked about last time, two great students of the Baal Shem Tov, Rav Dov Ber of Mezerich, who is the one who galvanizes people around him, creates students who go out and become our first cohort of tzaddikim. And then there is Rav Yaakov Yosef of Polanorik, who gathers the writings of the Besht and publishes them in 1781. That prompts a response again from Vilna, another cherem against this work, right, against them, and you can see that it is copied in several other communities as well. By 1796, there is a rumor that goes around that, in fact, the Vilna Gaon has made peace with the Chasidim. The Vilna Gaon wants to make it clear, right, that is not the case. He dies ultimately in 1797, and things get even a little bit worse, right, in the immediate aftermath of the Vilna Gaon's death. So, what exactly is the Vilna Gaon's role in all of this? We said he wasn't the official rabbi of Vilna. He didn't even sit on the Beis Din. So we actually do have accounts today that give us some sense of what the Vilna Gaon's role in all of this was. This comes from a book called The Gaon of Vilna, written by Emmanuel Eckes. And it says as follows. And the leaders and the court, this is in Vilna, sent people out to search for their books and writings. This is the investigation that we just referred to. And they found strange writings there, that it is impossible to write openly, and space is too small. There were writings that indicated, one of the things that particularly irked many were references to that conjured sexual imagery in the Kabbalistic, in service of Kabbalistic ideas of unification of the Jewish people with Hashem, those types of things. And a ban was proclaimed after testimony was given about their actions, and a legal hearing was held about their unseemly actions, also their foolishness of the upper parts below and the lower parts above. These were accounts of handstands that were being done during davening in the Hasidic shtibel, gesticulations, people getting all swept up, physically swept up, right, in their davening, that they were saying things, doing things that seemed well outside of what was considered to be proper inside of a shul. And one of them was polluted with lying with a man, and he confessed to this before the court, and also other ignoble things, and they interrupted their prayers with words in Yiddish. And the leaders of the Vilna community visited the Gaon HaChasid to ask him his opinion. And he said it was a duty to repel them and pursue them and reduce them and drive them from the land. So was he officially on the Beis Din? No. But did they go seek out? Did he play a role in this? Without a doubt. Then the leaders sat, and also two groups of judges, and the rabbi was the chief justice, and there was a verdict to burn their writings at their pillory before Kabbalah Shabbos. And Moreno Issar, the head of the sect, should go up on the topmost step on the Shabbos before Shochenad, right? And in all the synagogues and houses of study, there should be no minyan, right? Here, but only in the synagogue, in the great house of study, and he should confess there in the formula that would be issued from the court. And then the warden, right, should excommunicate them, and all those associated with them should write letters of peace to the major community, to the holy community of Shklov, and to the holy community of Minsk. And when the verdict against, so that's what they decided, right? So they did their investigation. They went and asked the Vilna Gaon, do you agree? He says, yes, you should do everything you can. So this is what they decided to do. And when the verdict against Moreno Issar was issued, the Chassid was not present in Vilna, but in Antokolia. And on Friday, before the Holy Shabbos, he assembled the leaders and was angry with them. Why have you been lenient in your judgment? That was lenient. If it depended on me, I would have done to them as Eliyahu Hanavi did to the VA Baal. What did he do to them? Yes, he killed them. And the Chassid wished to place Moreno Issar in the pillory. The pillory, that's the thing that locks you up, right? Okay, in the public square. And the Chassid wished to place Moreno Issar in the pillory. Only the leaders did not desire that, and they struck him with a rubber whip in the kahal room before the welcoming of the Shabbos. And then they burned their writings before the pillory. And before Shochenad, he went up on the upper step, and the Chasidim, his comrades, stood at his right, and afterwards they banned him. And all that week, he sat in prison, in the jail, in the citadel, they call the Schloss, and on the Shabbos night, he was held in the kahal. It's pretty intense. Was the Vilna Gaon involved? Absolutely, right? The Vilna Gaon was involved. Okay, so extreme brilliance, extreme confidence, extreme punctiliousness, extreme asceticism, extreme in his opposition to Chassidus. We now know a little bit about the Vilna Gaon. So what about the 19th century? Well, this is where we left off last time, right? In the end of the 18th century. So the major developments in Eastern Europe over the course of the 19th century look something like this. So we talked already about the founding of the Volozhiner Yeshiva in 1803. That is followed in 1815 by the opening of the Mir Yeshiva, and then from there on, multiple other yeshivos will open over the course of the 19th century, all kind of modeled and patterned after the Volozhiner Yeshiva, was known as Aim HaYeshivos. This isn't the time or the place to get into what made the Volozhiner Yeshiva different from those that came before it, but it was distinctly different, begins what we refer to today as a yeshiva movement. We mentioned in 1808 that the Talmidei Hagra, these followers of the Vilna Gaon, people who kept his halachic practice, decided to make their way to the land of Israel. In 1815, we showed you the maps. That's really where this spread of Hasidus begins already in 1772. The 1815 now, throughout the course of the 19th century, Hasidus is spreading, and it's spreading fast. By 1828, we have the first inklings, public inklings, of what is known as the Haskalah in Eastern Europe. The Haskalah of Eastern Europe and the Enlightenment of Western Europe are two different things. Right? What you need to know for now, and again, we could do a whole lecture series on this, but what you need to know now about the Russian Haskalah is that Russian Haskalah was looking to, at least in its first several generations, simply to expand the breadth of what Jews did. They weren't necessarily anti-religion. One of the famous poets of Yehuda Leib Gordon, right, famously wrote, "Be a man in the streets and a Jew at home." Right? Engage with the best of Western thought, with Russian culture. Right? There's no contradiction between the two. You can do them both. In 1848, there was an attempt to open a rabbinical seminary to train modern rabbis in Eastern Europe. Do you know who they wanted as the Rosh Yeshiva? Anybody? If you know this, I'll be impressed.
Not that impressive.
Their first pick, the person that they wanted to run that, who even gave it some thought, was Yisrael Salanter. That was 1848. So beginning in the 1820s, through this period up until about the 1880s, right, when much of the vision of the Russian Haskalah will come to an end because of pogroms, right, there was this vision that we could create a modern Jewish Russian society. Good. That begins in 1828. By 1842, Rabbi Salanter is now active in Vilna, creating a very different focus to his learning, believing that we have now, because of the opening of yeshivos, we have more young men learning Torah than ever before, but yet their practice doesn't seem to line up with what they know. They know a ton about Torah, but they're not exactly living Torah, practicing it quite the way they should. So a movement and an approach that focuses on the way we behave, right, begins to complement the learning that we're doing. That's the Muslim movement. By 1882, we have a full-fledged, right, Zionist movement that is up and functioning, right, with the first Aliyah that makes its way in 1882 and the first Zionist Congress in 1897. Why am I telling you all of this? Why is this important? How does it relate to the Vilna Gaon? Huh? Context for what? Understanding what's going on. But the Vilna Gaon passes away in 1797. He's not alive for any of this. Well, watch this. Why would the Vilna Gaon's extreme brilliance play into the story of the 19th century? Well, we have the beginnings of a yeshiva movement, started by Chaim Abolodin, who was a student of the Vilna Gaon. Who is going to want to take the Vilna Gaon as the leader of this movement? Who are they going to point to as the epitome of a Talmud student, of somebody who learns Torah? There's been nobody greater than the Vilna Gaon. Clearly, the Vilna Gaon stands at the image of the Vilna Gaon, becomes critical for creating this movement, this resurgence of Torah learning. Well, who are our early Russian maskilim going to look to as an example of a Torah Jew who could also learn math, science, music? Who are they going to point to? Who better than the Vilna Gaon? And by the time we get to the second half of the century, actually even earlier on, there were many and they were involved in the Russian Haskalah who were interested in things like finding the original text. That's the beginnings of an academic Jewish study of looking for manuscripts and trying to determine whether this text is the right one or not. Where better to look? Who better to look back to for an example of this than the Vilna Gaon? Extreme punctiliousness? Well, again, I believe that the Vilna Gaon was on his way to Israel for that reason. But either way, he was on his way to Israel, right? So, and what happens in the middle of the 19th century? We have the beginnings of a Zionist movement. Now, to be sure, much of the Zionist movement that emerges by the end of the 19th century is secular, right? And they're not necessarily pointing back to the Vilna Gaon, but there will be a subset of them who who were very much are part of the religious world, the Merkaz Ruchani, right? For the early Zionist movement, Merkaz Ruchani gets abbreviated to Mizrahi, right? These are the early religious Zionists, and who better to point to as the father of early religious Zionism than the Vilna Gaon? What about the next one? You know where I'm going with this. Exactly. In the middle of the 19th century comes a movement, right, that is focused on the way we behave, on resisting our temptations, about pushing back. Now, again, there are different schools of Mussar that arise, but it's certainly one major school is pushing back against some of the temptations, natural temptations we might have. Who better to look? I mean, you saw his words himself. He's writing to his daughter, right, and to his wife, and telling them to learn Mussar. It's extremely important for their training. Good. And extreme opposition to Chassidus, well, not so much, right? Of what happens in the 19th century is Chassidus is now spreading right? And those who see themselves under an attack from the spread of Hasidus are going to point to the real Hasid who was Vilna. So what happens over the course of the 19th century is that the image of the Vilna Gaon becomes incredibly important by several different groups with different foci who want different things and are claiming the Vilna Gaon for themselves, perhaps accurately, perhaps not. But this image becomes incredibly important. Right? So, looking back at these pictures, right? So these express very different ideas. We can imagine, right, these two pictures coming from very different camps. Right? Clearly, this, by the way, there is none of those pictures has a Gemara open like this. This is the only one, right, that I've seen. But we can imagine, right, an image like this coming from the world of the yeshivos. He's got a book, right, open. He's got a Gemara open in front of him. There's nothing too fancy here. It's very plain, right? We can imagine this coming from a very different place, right? From a place that has a different agenda, that's interested, right, in whether it be early Zionism. I don't know, but maybe it's certainly a more modern, right, more refined vision of the Vilna Gaon. Well, let me show you this. This picture claims to be the only original copy, right? I don't buy that. But let's actually start with this one. This one actually looks to me possibly to be one of the oldest pictures that we have of the Vilna Gaon. Do we? Oh, I'm covering a really critical piece here. So let's note, right? Let's note this, what we have in this picture. So we have this pose, by the way, is in almost all the pictures. They're showing what? They don't work there? Okay. So they may be on his yarmulke, right? They may be tucked under his yarmulke, could be. All right. But so we have this garb, which again probably is rabbinical garb, probably not something that the Vilna Gaon wore, right? But we have this sort of draping behind him. He's got a book, he's not writing, but he's holding his books, and we've got this interesting clock here, right? On the now the clock is actually, as far as I can tell, on top of the curtain. So there's a curtain like this on this side too, and somebody decided to put a clock in there. Okay. What do we notice here? Same pose, but now he's writing. Right? The clock is still there, but the clock is strangely suspended. Right? First of all, it's in front of the curtain here, and it's like attached to a book. I don't know. It's in front of the bookcase. For some reason, that clock made its way from, I'm assuming, from that previous picture, right, to this one. Look at that. Now that clock is a big deal, right? Somehow that clock is that the numbers are wrong. 5, 6, 7. Interesting. Okay. Upside down. Okay. That's really interesting. Now, and there's also something written on here which we can't see right in this picture. But watch what happens in this one. Now, can you read it? Anybody read that? It says London. The Vilna Gaon had a clock from London hanging on his bookshelf. Now, so what is it? Why is it there? It's probably some association with the West, right? Whether it earlier on, it was an association perhaps with a more Yekish culture, I don't know. Right? Somebody, though, at some point decided, right, that they truly wanted to identify, and there were, by the way, into the 20th century, there were stories of the Vilna Gaon showing up in England, checking the Oxford manuscripts, which again we have no evidence of. But there's clearly an attempt to associate the Vilna Gaon with trends in the West, and this picture itself, right, is that. Right? This is a Western rabbi. This is not an Eastern European rabbi pictured in this. So what we're seeing here is clearly an attempt to use the image of the Vilna Gaon to identify him with certain trends, which again, maybe he did or didn't identify with. In terms of, oh, this is one of my favorites. Do you see it? It was photoshopped out before there was Photoshop. Somebody decided that the London big clock is not from. And so you can see they colored over it, right? Because somebody wanted to recapture the Vilna Gaon for their particular ideology, their particular perspective, which does not include, right, a clock from London on the Svarim Shank. So it's gone. The Hebrew is the year. This was actually this was printed at the 100th year of his death. Now, were these used? Well, picture on the right is a Tzvi Hirsch Rappaport, the author of the Piskei Agra, lived in the late 19th century. This is an actual photograph of him, and what do you notice? That's our clock picture, right? Up there on the left. Now, I apologize for this. I had to get it off the internet. I thought I had my own picture of it, but I couldn't find it. This is Beit Harav Kook, right? In the center of Yerushalayim, right? Not far from Ben Yehuda. If you've never been there, you should go. This is the salon of Beit Harav Kook, set up the way it was when Rav Kook lived there. The pictures on his wall were pictures when Rav Kook lived there. And can you see it? Yep, there in the top. Anybody know who this is underneath? That is the Balatanya. Excellent. Yes, the Rav Kook had pictures of the Vilna Gaon and the Balatanya on his wall. But again, the point being that the picture, the image of the Vilna Gaon became extremely important, an important way of identifying who you were and identifying him with you. Okay. Now I know we're a little late. Are we good for 5 more minutes? Can we do that? Okay, because I've got one more piece that I want to share, which is as follows. There are historians today, right, who will argue that in fact the influence of the Vilna Gaon is more attributable to this period of time, to the period of time when his image becomes extremely important, than to this period of time. Somebody asked me how he was received, right? He was well known in his time. We know that for sure. He's invoked in the Eibshitz Emden controversy. We know that he was known, right? But the argument that historians have made is that the real influence of the Vilna Gaon comes from the image of the Vilna Gaon and not from the actual writings of the Vilna Gaon. I've mentioned his name several times. Emanuel Etkes is absolutely one of the finest historians of early modern European Jewry. He writes in his book on the Vilna Gaon, the influence of the Gaon in the flourishing of the world of Torah in Lithuania was not as direct or transparent as was his involvement in the struggle against Hasidism. For his writing, his method of study, and his halachic decisions were not widely disseminated. However, this cannot diminish the vitality and power radiated by the Gaon as a symbol and a source of inspiration. So people didn't read him. They didn't read his writings, but the symbol of the Gaon, that was important. Shaul Stamfer is right up there with Emanuel Etkes as one of the other great historians of this period. Shaul Stamfer is known for his works on the yeshiva movement. Nothing compares to the work that he has done in that field. He writes in this article found in this work that the role often popularly attributed to the Gaon in the formation of Misnagdim ideology also has to be questioned. It is not clear, he writes, to what degree the writings of the Gaon were studied in the first generations of his death. And he goes so far as to say in this quote, great rabbis have been known more by their works than by their names, right? The Ktsos, right? The Mishnah Berurah, I guess Chafetz Chaim. Other scholars were talked about by name, but not read. The Gaon seems to have been in this category. Now, I want to be very clear here, right, that the next book I'm going to show you does not belong, right, mentioned together with people like Etkes and Stamfer. They are the giants of this field. This next person is hardly anything but. However, he does take issue with this And I want to share that with you before we close. The evidence that Stamfer cites is the publication history of the Vilna Gaon, arguing that the printed works of the Vilna Gaon's actual writings only really flourish after his biographies are first published. So people get to know the image of the Vilna Gaon, and that leads them to say, what do they actually write? Not the reverse. And the second is he argues that there was very little citation of the Vilna Gaon in the early years following the Vilna Gaon, in his late years and following his death. So here's a chart, right, that sort of shows that argument. He argues the major publication of the Gra's works happens here in 1850 and post. And 1858 marks the first printing of Aliyos Eliyahu, which is the first full-scale biography of the Vilna Gaon. And in the 1820s, there was another spike, and that was after the publication of Maaseh Rav, which also gave us some certain biographical information about the Vilna Gaon. But here's the work that, again, does not belong mentioned here, is this one. But there is a chapter in this book, in case you actually want to read it, right, that will take on both Stamfer and Edkis on this particular issue. And here are the arguments that this book makes. Number one, the publication history does point to the early interest in the Gra's writing. You have to understand something about the print industry in Europe at the time. There is another spike, a first spike in the printing of the Gaon's work, pretty close to the time of his death. And what we actually see, this line underneath here, these are the opening of new printing houses. See, there were very few printing houses earlier on, by the end of the 18th century, the early 19th century. If you have only a few printing houses, those houses get dominated by your basic works, by Chumash, by Gemaras, right, that need to be printed for Cheder. The minute more printing houses open up, we have an immediate spike which shows interest in the Vilna Gaon's works. You also have to consider, right, the population growth. Population at this time was much smaller than the population, right, by the end of the 19th century. So 42 publications of the Vilna Gaon's work in 1810 may very well be comparable to 71 publications of the Vilna Gaon's work in this decade of 1851 to 1860. Next. The way early Sfarim were published and circulated was always through pre-subscriptions. Some people would commit to paying because otherwise you couldn't fund or finance the publication of a Sefer. If you read through, and many of these Sfarim have subscription lists in them, right, you begin to see that many of the subscribers in these early works are not individuals, but they are Batei Medrash. So this comes from the Avos Rabbi Nathan with the Gra's. Is it? Let's see. Should be here. There it is. That's the subscription list. That's there at the end. And sorry for the there. Right. This is just one small section of it. Each one of these subscribers is subscribing Lebeis Midrasha, Lebeis Midrasha Haggadah, Lebeis Midrasha. Meaning you can't count individual works at a time where people didn't have personal libraries, right? When you still had to go to the base medrash to get a sefer, right? Though the impact of one publication was far greater than it will be later on when personal libraries emerge. Okay, next. We're almost there, I promise. The other thing that Stamfer does not account for is the fact that the Gra's writing is also circulating in manuscript form, for sure. Well, early after, in the immediate years after his death, well into the 19th century. So looking simply at the printing record isn't going to tell you everything, right? Because we know that these are circulating. How do we know that they're circulating? Well, this is a proclamation, a declaration from the Vilna Beis Din, telling you not to believe all the other things that are circulating in the names of the Vilna Gaon. Right? And nothing can be treated as the work of the Vilna Gaon unless it gets the stamp of approval from the sons of the Vilna Gaon. But the very need for this attests to the fact that there was a lot of stuff that was circulating in manuscript. When they say specifically, you may not print anything in the name of the Vilna Gaon unless it's gotten the actual signature of the sons of the Vilna Gaon. And here's one little citation. Oh, I guess it's not in here. Okay. In terms of the citations, I was going to show you one other piece where the author clearly refers to at least 3 different manuscripts of the Vilna Gaon's writing that he saw before he published his version. But getting on to the work of citation, again, Shaul Stampfer said that it was not widely cited. He refers to the Aruch HaShulchan and the fact that the Aruch HaShulchan is a major work of 19th century halacha, and he says the citations, the references to the Vilna Gaon and the Aruch HaShulchan are very few. That's surprising. That bolsters his theory that he was not widely read. Right? Unfortunately, though, or if you look in the right places, so Rabbi Naftali Tzvi Yehuda Berlin, the Netziv, also contemporary and actually a younger contemporary of the Aruch HaShulchan, just as prominent in the world of the 19th century. He too is the Rosh Yeshiva. He becomes Rosh Yeshiva of the Volozhiner Yeshiva, and in his work, just as work of Shilos and Chuvos of Responsa, we have over 200 citations of the Gross work. And the last piece is that an entire generation of Torah scholars will emerge who actually are doing exactly what the Vilna Gaon were doing. They were interested in Midrash, in Zohar, in other texts outside of the strict canon of learning Gemara. They were interested actually in learning things like math and science and grammar. There was a whole world of them. Unfortunately, I can't give you a lecture on them right now. You can read the book, right? But they were quite widely known, right? And this was not an individual here or individual there. There was a whole circle of Misnagdim, of Lithuanian prominent rabbinic figures who were engaged in almost exactly the same kind of study that the Vilna Gaon was immediately after his death. Why don't you know about them? You don't know about them because they were eclipsed by the yeshiva. Because the minute the yeshiva rises, there becomes a curriculum. There becomes yeshiva shemesechtos. There become the things that, and our focus actually becomes far more narrow than it was early on in the 19th century. And you also have the rise of the Haskalah movement. And by the end of the 19th century, you get labeled. It means something to be studying grammar or to be studying math or science. You sort of get labeled as chutz lamachana, as outside of the camp. And so there is definitely a progression away from it by the end of the 19th century. And only very few select individuals actually make it out of the 19th century continuously involved in those areas of study. But in the first half of the 19th century, this was not something you did under your Gemara. And this is something people engaged in. Rabbinic scholars engaged in. The Maggid of Vilna was clearly reading, right, from all sorts of broad works. There were major scholars. They were quoting people like Mendelssohn with no compunction, right? This was the world of early 19th century Talmud study, Torah study. So in fact, the influence of the Vilna Gaon, I contend, was actually quite strong early on in the beginning of the 19th century. That then leads us back to, one last piece. I can't even read this for you. You have to read it. Can you read it? Because I need to leave us on, with something heartwarming. This is probably one of the most incredible emails I've ever gotten in my life. This is from Shaul Stampfer. Can you read it? No, you can't read it in the back? I can't even read it. All right, I'll read it. This is from Shaul Stampfer, right? Who was the one who argued that the Vilna Gaon's writings were not read. This is from 2009. Greetings, this letter is long overdue. My apologies. I finally sat down to read your thesis, and I really enjoyed it. I learned a great deal about topics I thought I was familiar with. Your analysis is very well grounded and often profound. It is also significant. Your comments about my work were quite justified. I have to think over carefully what you wrote. And then he goes on to encourage me to publish my thesis as a book. And that is very much why the book exists today, because he reached out to me. Right? So academics are not always known for the menschlichkeit. Shaul Stamfer is a mensch of all mensches, and what he did for me, right, is something that I have eternal gratitude for. So I cannot leave a lecture slugging up his thesis without also telling you that this was his response and the beauty in which he did it. So that brings us back to where we started. Ultimately, this was the world in which the Vilna Gaon, right, the image of the Vilna Gaon clearly plays a major role in everything that happens in the 19th century, but it was clearly influential in the world that happened before. But as we mentioned when we first started our lecture series, there's one sort of piece of this whole story that we're missing, as we've seen the rise of the religious world of the 18th and then the 19th century. The one piece that's clearly missing from the entire story is about half the population of this community, right? The question of how do either of these two stories, the story of the rise of Hasidus and the impact it has on the religious world, or the rise of the Vilna Gaon and the yeshiva movement and the world that comes after that, how do any of those impact the lives of Jewish women living at the time? That's going to be our last topic for our last lecture. Have a good night.
Thank you so much.